Tonight's story begins inside a building most of Chicago had already forgotten. By 1989, the Lexington Flats was old, half-occupied, and fading quietly a few blocks from Wrigley Field. It wasn't notorious, and it wasn't the kind of place people warned you about. It was simply the sort of building people stopped seeing after a while. But in early November, tenants began hearing movement inside apartment 3B, a unit that had already been sitting empty for months. What followed involved a missing tenant, a second man, who may never have officially lived there at all, a building whose ownership seemed impossible to pin down, and a property the city still has not managed to tear down. This is Case 001.
This is Unverified Crime Stories. Cases built from documented events where the details don't fully align.
In November of 1989, something started happening inside a building known as the Lexington Flats, a 4-story apartment structure on the north side of Chicago that, by then, had quietly fallen behind everything built around it. It wasn't dangerous, and it wasn't the kind of place people warned you about. It was simply old, worn down, and increasingly overlooked. The kind of building that remained standing mostly because no one had gotten around to replacing it. The tenants who still lived there understood the building. They knew the pipes rattled, the floors carried sound, and the walls didn't always behave the way newer construction did. So when the first complaint came in, it didn't immediately register as anything unusual. It came from Elaine Harper, who lived alone in 2B. Elaine was in graduate school at the time, studying library science, and she fit the building in a way that made sense. She was curious, shy, and introverted, the kind of tenant who noticed things because she spent so much time in silence. Most evenings, she stayed inside her apartment, surrounded by stacks of books, note cards, and legal pads covered in careful handwriting. Her place was modest but orderly, with secondhand furniture, a narrow bed pushed against the wall, and a reading lamp near a small desk by the window. It was the kind of apartment where even a faint, unfamiliar sound would stand out immediately. And that is exactly what happened. Elaine reported hearing footsteps in the apartment directly above her. At first, management dismissed it. Old building, sound carries. But Elaine didn't describe it like normal building noise. She said the footsteps didn't move across the room, didn't pass overhead, and didn't come and go the way someone walking normally would. Instead, they stayed contained to one area of the apartment, faint but consistent, like activity happening in a fixed space rather than someone moving through it. That detail mattered because apartment 3B was supposed to be empty. It had been vacant since April, when the previous tenant, Lucille Voss, disappeared. Lucille was 58, lived alone, and kept such a regular routine that neighbors noticed when it stopped. She didn't give notice, didn't pack, and didn't tell anyone she was leaving. One week she was there, and the next she wasn't. When management entered her apartment, everything was still in place. Clothes in the closet, dishes in the sink, a television still plugged into the wall, and on the kitchen counter, a small round fishbowl with a dead goldfish at the bottom, next to an open container of fish food that had been partially spilled, as if it had been knocked over mid-use. It didn't look like someone had moved out. It looked like something had interrupted them. No missing person report was ever filed. The unit was cleared, listed, and left empty. That decision did not go unnoticed, at least not by everyone. Elaine would later say that when she first heard the sounds in November, what unsettled her most was not just the sound itself, but the fact that no one had ever explained what happened to Lucille. The apartment had been treated like a vacancy, not a disappearance. And once that thought settled in, it became difficult to separate the two. Within a few days, other tenants began reporting similar sounds. Different units, different floors, but nearly identical descriptions of activity above them that felt too consistent to be dismissed as random noise. One tenant insisted it was just the building settling. Another said the sounds weren't traveling through the building at all. They were happening inside the apartment, in the same place, over and over again. Maintenance checked the unit. The supervisor at the time was a man named Victor Krall, an Eastern European immigrant who had been working in the building for years. Among the tenants, Victor had a reputation for being capable, scrappy, and permanently irritated. He was usually seen in the basement or near the service entrance, wearing the same worn coat regardless of weather, his hands rough, his hair unevenly cut, his face unshaven. He looked like a man who had stopped expecting things to improve. Victor unlocked apartment 3B, walked it with another worker, and reported nothing unusual. No signs of entry, no disturbance, no explanation. According to him, the building was old, and people were hearing what they expected to hear. But by November 10th, the reports changed. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. People began describing something heavier, slower, like objects being moved across the floor in short, deliberate intervals. Elaine heard it too, and she said it followed a pattern. Stillness first, then movement, then silence again. That is where apartment 3B began to stand out, because 3B sat directly over an older section of the building that had never been fully modernized. The piping and ventilation under that part of the structure dated back decades, and certain access points had been sealed instead of replaced. In practical terms, it meant fewer people wanted to open it up, and fewer people wanted to document what was there. On November 18th, a tenant called the police. 2 officers arrived just after 2 a.m, entered apartment 3B, and searched it. They found no one, no signs of forced entry, and no clear explanation. But they did note that part of the floor felt warmer than the surrounding area. That detail went nowhere. For 6 days, everything stopped. No sounds. No complaints. Nothing. Then, on November 24th, it started again. Same time each night. Just after 2 a.m. Only now, tenants described something more structured. Not just movement. Repetition. As if something was being done, paused, and done again. Around that time, tenants began asking questions about the building itself. Who owned it? Who was responsible? And they got nowhere. The property was tied to a chain of trusts and holding companies that seemed to loop back on themselves, one entity pointing to another, and then another, until the trail disappeared entirely. There was no clear owner, no single name, no one accountable. Not long after that, apartment 3B was leased. There was no listing, no showing, no explanation. His name was Daniel Reeves, 32, recently relocated. He moved in quietly, carried in a few boxes, and kept to himself. At first, that should have resolved everything. But according to Elaine, the sounds didn't stop. They changed. Some could be explained by Daniel. Some couldn't. Within days, Daniel began to change too, avoiding people, looking exhausted, listening, even when no one was speaking. And when told about Lucille Voss, he said something that stayed with the tenants. They told me she moved out. By then, it was clear that wasn't true. After that, activity inside the apartment intensified. Movement, impacts, objects shifting. And on at least one night, a tenant next door reported hearing 2 separate movements happening at once. Management insisted everything was under control. Victor told one tenant that people were connecting things that didn't belong together. But by then, the tenants had their own theories. Elaine believed someone had access to the unit the entire time. Another tenant thought something physical, heat, pipes, or even a chemical leak, was affecting both the apartment and the people around it. A third believed the building was being used for something off the books, and that 3B had been overlooked on purpose. None of them could prove any of it. On December 6th, Daniel Reeves was gone. No notice. No explanation. No forwarding address. His keys were found inside the apartment, and when tenants tried to confirm he had ever lived there was nothing. No lease. No record. No trace. After Daniel disappeared, the building began to empty. Not all at once, but steadily. Elaine stayed longer than most. She later said the sounds never fully stopped. They just became harder to define. Years later, the Lexington Flats was scheduled for demolition. Permits were approved. Crews were assigned. A date was set. But the demolition never happened. The permits were revoked. No explanation. No approval since. Which leaves a set of questions that were never answered. Why was apartment 3B treated differently? Why was Lucille Voss never reported missing? Was something inside the unit responsible? Who was Daniel Reeves? And why is there no record he was ever there? And if the building was simply old, why has it never been allowed to come down? Because depending on which version of events you believe, this was either neglect or something else entirely. And that part was never verified.